In a town that prized conformity, Ilara's greatest sin was his imagination. They called him the town's failure. The village of Veritas was a place of straight lines and sharp corners, a community built on the unshakable foundation of predictability. Every cobblestone was perfectly placed, every market stall opened at the exact same second, and every citizen followed a path laid out for them from birth. They were stonemasons, weavers, and bakers, practical people who dealt in what they could see and touch. Ilara, however, dealt in the unseen. He chased whispers of energy, collected strangely shaped river stones that hummed when you held them just right, and spent his days building contraptions that served no real purpose. His latest was a collection of spindly copper legs and gears designed to follow the sun across the sky. He'd spent a month painstakingly building it. When he presented it in the town square, hoping to show how it could predict the subtle shifts in seasons, a gear slipped. A leg buckled. The whole thing collapsed into a twitching, useless heap of metal. Laughter echoed off the stone walls. It was a familiar sound to Ilara, the chorus of a town that saw him not as a dreamer, but as a fool. He was the town's one, glaring imperfection, a gear that just wouldn't fit in the flawless clockwork of Veritas. Life in Veritas was a symphony of quiet work, each day a perfect repeat of the last. The sun would rise, casting long, orderly shadows. The baker would knead his dough, the weaver's loom would clatter in a steady rhythm, and the children would learn lessons of practicality and purpose. There was a deep comfort in this routine, a solid belief that as long as the patterns were followed, nothing could ever really go wrong. Their world was dependable and safe. Then, the silence began. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a creepy, invasive emptiness that started at the edges of town and slowly seeped in. It began subtly. First, the birds stopped singing. The cheerful chirps that usually greeted the dawn were just gone. Then, the vibrant colors of the world started to fade. The deep green of the valley pines dulled, the brilliant crimson of the primrose softened to a dusty pink, and the sky itself seemed to lose its bright azure, settling into a pale, washed-out blue. Soon after, the sickness arrived. They called it the Grey Veil. It started with a profound lethargy, a weariness that settled deep in your bones. Then, the skin of the sick would take on a pale, greyish tint, as if they were slowly turning to stone. Laughter died on the streets, replaced by the shuffling of feet and weak, rasping coughs. The once bustling market square grew quiet, its energy draining away like the color from the sky. Panic, a foreign and unwelcome emotion in Veritas, began to take root. The town council, led by the stern Mayor Borin, immediately called upon the Alchemists' Guild. These were the town's experts, men who dealt in herbs, poultices, and remedies passed down for generations. They were masters of the known. They examined the suffering, consulted their ancient books, and brewed potions that steamed with familiar, pungent odors. They prescribed bed rest and bitter tinctures. But the Grey Veil didn't care about their expertise. The sickness spread, relentless and unstoppable. The alchemists, for the first time in their history, were powerless. Their trusted formulas were useless. Desperation began to crack the town's perfect order as they watched their world crumble into a landscape of fear and decay. While the town's experts were looking for answers in dusty books, Ilara was listening. In his cluttered workshop, a chaotic cathedral of gears and half-finished projects, he'd noticed something everyone else had missed. His whole life was a study of things others ignored, the subtle hum of a beehive, the resonant frequency of a crystal struck by moonlight, the intricate patterns of frost on a window. And now, he was studying the plague. He had built a device years ago, one of his most ridiculed failures. It was a series of delicate, spun glass funnels connected to a brass diaphragm, designed, as he'd tried to explain, to listen to the sound of things that don't make noise. The townspeople had laughed, calling it an ear for ghosts. But now, as he pointed it toward the sickened parts of town, it registered something. A low, discordant hum. A frequency that was utterly alien to the natural harmony of the valley. It was the sound of absence, a vibration of decay that seemed to cancel out the very resonance of life. He moved through the quieted town at dusk, a strange figure with his bizarre listening device. He noticed the Grey Veil seemed to advance in waves, in pulses. It wasn't a germ carried on the wind, not like the alchemists thought. It was a pervasive harmonic, a dissonant chord being played on the very strings of existence. He saw how it affected everything. Water from the town well, when placed near his resonating crystals, made their faint glow dim and sputter. The leaves on the sickest trees no longer rustled with the sound of life, but with a dry, papery hiss. A frantic spark of an idea ignited in his mind. He remembered another useless invention, a large quartz crystal in a cage of silver and copper, which would vibrate and emit a soft light when exposed to a specific sequence of musical tones. The elders had called it a fanciful lamp. He recalled a contraption of tuned metal chimes that was supposed to sync to crops to make them grow faster. It had, of course, failed spectacularly. But what if failure was just a matter of context? What if these nonsensical pieces weren't individual failures, but notes in a different kind of song? The plague had a frequency. It was a note of sickness. What if, he thought, his heart pounding with a terrifying and exhilarating hope, what if he could build a machine that could play the opposite note? Not a medicine to cure the body, but a harmony to retune the world. He burst into the emergency council meeting, his clothes smudged with grease and his hair a wild mess. "It's a sound," he exclaimed, holding up a hasty sketch. "The plague isn't a poison, it's a resonance. A frequency that's pulling the life out of everything. But I can build something to counteract it. I can create a harmonic wave that will push it back." Mayor Borin looked down, his face a mask of weary disdain. "Elara," he said, his voice heavy with the town's exhaustion. "We are dealing with a real crisis. We don't have time for your fantasies and your noisy toys. The alchemists are handling this. Go home. Do not bother us with this poetry." The dismissal was sharp and cold. Humiliated and furious, Elara stumbled back out into the grey streets. They'd shut him down. They only saw the failure, the outcast. They couldn't see the pattern he saw. As he stood in the square, watching a young mother weep as she carried her listless child indoors, a grim resolve hardened within him. They wouldn't help him. They wouldn't even listen. Fine. He would have to save them all by himself. Elara retreated to his workshop, the mayor's scorn ringing in his ears. But the rejection was a fire, not a weight. It burned away his doubt, leaving only the white-hot core of his purpose. If the world had fallen out of tune, he would be its conductor. He would compose a symphony of salvation from the scraps and failures of his life. He worked with a feverish intensity he'd never known. The sun rose and set, but he paid it no mind. His world was the flickering light of his oil lamp, the smell of hot metal, and the impossible blueprint taking shape in his mind. He started by dragging his largest failures into the center of the room. The sun-following machine, with its intricate copper framework, became the central armature. He reproposed its gears, not to follow the sun, but to rotate the massive crystals he'd spent years collecting. Days bled into nights. He barely ate, surviving on stale bread and cold water, fueled by adrenaline and obsession. He dismantled the crop singer, taking its tuned metal chimes and recalibrating them. He hammered and filed, his workshop filled with a cacophony of screeching metal as he painstakingly adjusted each chime to a specific frequency. These weren't random notes, they were the precise counter-harmonics to the plague's sickening hum. From a dusty corner, he pulled resonant chambers made from spun copper bowls, an old experiment meant to amplify the sound of running water. Now, he saw their true purpose. He wired them together with miles of copper thread, creating a complex circuit that connected the chimes, the crystals, and a new, powerful energy source he built from voltaic piles and magnetic coils, a device meant for a self-propelling cart that had famously exploded 2 years prior. As Elara worked, the world outside was dying. The silence in Veritas became absolute. The only sounds were the hollow echo of the wind and the rattling coughs of the few who could still move. He'd catch glimpses through his window, Elder Maeve, the town's kindest weaver, her hands now too weak to work. The blacksmith's forge was cold, its mighty owner confined to his bed. The grey veil was no longer creeping, it was consuming. The sight didn't distract him, it focused him. Every falling leaf was a tick of a clock, urging him to work faster. He faced countless setbacks. A crucial gear shattered, and he spent a full day carving a replacement from ironwood. His voltaic piles short-circuited, filling the workshop with acrid smoke and setting him back hours. In those quiet moments between the hammering, doubt crept in. The townspeople's laughter, the word failure, it all echoed in his head. He'd look at the monstrosity taking shape, a chaotic tangle of things that shouldn't belong together. Was the mayor right? Was this just the grandest of all his toys? But then he would hear it, the faint, sickly hum on his listening device, a constant reminder of the encroaching decay. He would remember the vacant look in the eyes of the sick, and he would push the doubt aside and get back to work. Slowly, impossibly, it began to come together. It was a bizarre spectacle. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, a monstrous, intricate assembly of spinning crystals, gleaming copper bowls, and a forest of metal chimes, all connected by a web of wires that pulsed with a faint, inner light. It looked like nothing Veritas had ever seen, part astronomical instrument, part pipe organ, part madman's dream. It was strange. It was chaotic. It was beautiful. And as he connected the final wire, a deep, resonant hum filled the workshop, a pure and steady tone that was the polar opposite of the plague's frequency. It was the sound of hope. With one last monumental effort, Ilara pushed his workshop doors open. The pale, grey light of the afternoon spilled in, illuminating the colossal machine. It was too heavy to carry, so he engaged a series of creaking wheels he'd attached to its base. With straining muscles and a groaning of wood and metal, he began to roll his creation into the deserted streets. The journey to the town square was an act of sheer will. The machine was unwieldy, and the cobblestones fought him every step of the way. The few people who saw him from their windows stared with dull, blank eyes. They just saw the town's failure, pushing his greatest absurdity yet through their dying world. Their silence was more unnerving than their usual scorn. He finally reached the center of the square, the very spot where his son-follower had collapsed into a heap of mockery. The square was eerily empty. Then, he heard shouting. Mayor Borin, flanked by 2 guards, marched towards him. The mayor's face, though tinged with the same grey weariness as everyone else, was set in a mask of grim authority. Ilara! What is the meaning of this madness? Borin's voice was a harsh rasp. I gave you an order. Take this monstrosity, and go back to your hovel. You're spreading false hope. There is no peace to disturb. Ilara shouted back, his voice raw with exhaustion and fury. And hope is all we have left. This machine can save us. Save us, the mayor scoffed. With what? More noise and broken parts? Guards, dismantle this thing. Now. The guards hesitated, their eyes flickering between the determined young man and the hulking, humming machine. Just as they moved forward, a weak cry came from the steps of the apothecary. It was a young girl, Lyra, the baker's daughter. Ilara knew her, she sometimes left sweet buns on his doorstep. Now, she was collapsing into her mother's arms, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the grey veil claiming her. That was it. No. Ilara roared. He threw his body in front of the machine. You have tried your way. You trusted your books and your traditions, and this town is dying. Now, you will see my way. Before they could react, he lunged for the main activation lever. He threw his weight against it, pulling it down with a loud, metallic shriek. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a low thrum that vibrated through the cobblestones, the machine shuddered to life. The gears began to turn. A soft, golden light emanated from the spinning crystals. The metal chimes, struck by automated hammers, began to ring out. It started as a single, pure note, then another, and another, building into a complex, soaring harmony. The sound poured from the copper bowls, not as a deafening noise, but as a physical wave of energy, a tangible pulse that washed over the square. The air itself seemed to shimmer. The people, the guards, even Mayor Borin, all froze, staring in utter disbelief. The harmonic wave expanded from the machine, a ripple of pure sound and golden light spreading through the town. It was a sound that was less heard and more felt, a vibration that resonated deep in your chest, in the very marrow of your bones. It was the antithesis of the plague's draining silence. It was the sound of creation, of life, of pure, vibrant energy. Where the wave passed, the world changed. The dull, grey tint on the skin of the sick began to recede, replaced by the warm blush of returning blood. The listless figures stirred, their eyes clearing as if waking from a long, terrible dream. The young girl, Lyra, who had collapsed moments before, took a deep, shuddering breath, and colour flooded back into her cheeks. Her mother cried out, not in grief, but in stunned, joyous relief. The mayor and his guard stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and dawning understanding. They watched as the very stones of the square seemed to brighten, the grey film of the plague dissolving under the machine's resonant light. A single, brave bird, perched on a nearby roof, let out a tentative chirp, a sound no one had heard in weeks. Another answered it, and then another, until the air filled with a joyful chorus. The world was coming back to life. The people in the square slowly got to their feet, their movements no longer weak, but filled with returning strength. They looked at Ilara, not with scorn or pity, but with profound, humbling gratitude. Conclusion. The machine stood silent in the center of the square, its light faded but its presence monumental. It was no longer a collection of scraps and failures, it was a symbol. It was proof that imagination wasn't a sin, and that the most unconventional ideas could hold the key to salvation. Ilara, the town's failure, was now its hero. He hadn't just built a machine, he had reminded Veritas that sometimes, the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected instruments. If you believe in the power of unconventional ideas, share this story. And for more tales of ingenuity and the triumph of the human spirit, make sure you're subscribed.